Colonial police archives accidentally preserved resistance. In the early 1940s, inside Japanese occupied Korea, a group of Chinese migrants living in Incheon, excuse my pronunciation, formed a secret anti-colonial organization. Their names were mostly erased from public memory. Some died in prison, others disappeared into history, but decades later, an unexpected archive remained behind. Not because anyone intended to preserve their story, not because historians carefully documented their lives, but because colonial police surveillance accidentally recorded fragments of the spaces they inhabited. This essay explores how police, photography, architecture, and colonial archives became entangled in unexpected ways, producing what scholar Soojin Yum calls an accidental archive. The paper centers on a group called Ildan Hall, a secret anti-Japanese organization formed by Chinese migrants in Incheon during Japanese colonial rule in Korea. After members were arrested in 1943, Japanese colonial authorities photographed interiors, alleyways, staircases, courtyards, and buildings connected to the investigation. The goal was surveillance. The result was historical preservation. What emerged was a rare visual record of migrant architecture that has since disappeared. But the photographs preserved more than buildings. They also preserved evidence of hidden movement, cross-racial alliances, anti-colonial resistance, and alternative futures that colonial systems tried to erase. The paper asks a larger question. What happens when systems of control accidentally preserve the very histories they were trying to suppress? One of the most striking aspects of the article is its attention to architecture, not monumental architecture nor state buildings, but ordinary migrant spaces. Chinese shop houses, residential hotels, narrow alleyways, shared kitchens, temporary lodging spaces. These structures existed inside Incheon's Chinatown during Japanese colonial occupation. Many no longer exist today. And yet, through police photographs, fragments of their interior survive. The paper focuses especially on two buildings, Fukinchan and Yongshengda. At first glance, these appear to be ordinary, but investigators discovered hidden passageways connecting them, narrow corridors, shared kitchens, back routes concealed from the street. The architecture itself enabled secrecy and movement. The buildings became tools of resistance. This transforms how we think about architecture. Architecture is often discussed as something static, permanent, visible, official. But in this paper, architecture becomes fugitive. It shelters movement, it conceals relationships, it creates possibilities outside colonial visibility. The police photographs unintentionally documented these hidden spatial relationships. The state attempted to map criminality. Instead, it documented resistance. This creates a strange paradox. Colonial surveillance became one of the only surviving records of anti-colonial migrant life. The article connects this paradox to broader debates about archives and historical memory. Who gets preserved in history? Who disappears? What kinds of lives are considered worthy of documentation. The paper, Future Archetypes, Architecture, Police Photography, and Decolonial Futures, um, draws on scholars like Michel Roff-Triot and Achille Mbebe to argue that archives are never neutral. Archives are systems of power. Certain events become visible, others are excluded. Entire populations can become historically invisible. Migrants are especially vulnerable to this disappearance. Working class migrants often leave behind few written records. Their lives move across borders, across temporary housing, across unstable labor systems. Traditional archives tend to privilege official documents, written correspondence, state records, and institutional memory. But migrant histories often survive differently through rumor, through oral history, through photographs, objects, and the architecture itself. This is why this article becomes so interested in police photography. Photography has long been connected to surveillance, especially racialized surveillance. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, photography became central to policing systems across colonial empires. Cameras were used to classify populations, track movement, construct racial categories, document criminality. Chinese communities, in particularly, were heavily surveilled. Across the United States and colonial Asia, Chinatowns were frequently portrayed as dangerous, secretive, diseased, or criminal spaces. Journalists and police photographers helped create these narratives visually. Photographs reinforced public fear. They turned architecture into evidence of racial suspicion. Dark interiors, crowded rooms, narrow alleyways. These visual tropes appeared repeatedly in newspapers and police investigations. This article shows how these representations shaped anti-Chinese sentiment in colonial Korea. But the Ildan Hall photographs complicate this narrative because when we look carefully at these images today, different meanings emerge. The same photographs that once functioned as surveillance now function as historical evidence of migrant survival and political resistance. This reversal is one of the most powerful ideas in the paper. Images do not remain fixed, archives do not remain stable, meanings change over time. A police photograph taken to criminalize migrants can later become evidence of erased histories. The paper also reveals how migration itself was deeply entangled with colonial labor systems. Japanese authorities simultaneously relied upon and feared Chinese migrants. Chinese laborers were economically useful, but they were also treated as suspicious outsiders. This contradiction shaped colonial governance. Migrants were categorized constantly, measured, surveyed, observed. Japanese ethnographers and administrators conducted extensive studies on Chinese communities in Korea during the 1920s and the 1930s. These studies claimed scientific objectivity, but they were deeply tied to colonial power. Photography helped construct racial categories. The camera became a tool for producing knowledge about colonized populations. And yet, once again, the archive exceeds its original purpose. Because alongside these systems of categorization, unintended details survive. Doorways, courtyards, kitchen spaces, architectural improvisations, moments of intimacy, evidence of everyday life. This excess is crucial. The archive never fully controls meaning. Something always escapes. This paper repeatedly returns to the idea of fugitivity. not simply as physical escape, but as a way of surviving within oppressive systems. The hidden passageways between buildings become symbolic of this larger idea. Movement beyond official visibility, communication beyond surveillance, alternative relationships beyond colonial classification. This connects the article to broader discussions of decolonial futures. The paper argues that these photographs do not simply document the past, they also allow us to imagine different futures. One especially important section discusses rumors shared within Incheon's Chinese community. According to oral histories, some Chinese residents secretly helped Korean anti-colonial activists by lending them shoes. If Japanese police saw Chinese shoes outside a building, they might assume the residents belonged to Chinese migrants and avoid entering. Whether every detail of the story is verifiable becomes less important than what the rumor itself reveals. A desire to remember cross-racial solidarity, a desire to imagine cooperation rather than division. Colonial systems often rely on separating populations, categorizing people into rigid identities, citizen and non-citizen, native and migrant, loyal and suspicious. But the paper suggests that real life was always more complicated. Relationships formed across imposed boundaries. Architecture itself facilitated these relationships. Shared spaces created opportunities for alliance. The essay ultimately challenges how we think about archives. We often imagine archives as stable institutions preserving objective truth, but this paper suggests something very different. Archives are fragmented, partial, accidental. Sometimes the most important histories survive indirectly. A police investigation becomes an architectural archive. A surveillance photograph becomes evidence of resistance. A hidden corridor becomes proof of collaboration. What survives history is often unpredictable, and what disappears is often shaped by power. The paper also asks us to think differently about migrants, not merely as victims, not merely as labor, but as political actors, as people actively shaping space, community, and resistance under colonial rule. The architecture of this Chinatown was not passive. It was adaptive, flexible, protective, relational. The buildings themselves participated in political life, and this may be one of the article's most important contributions. It shifts architecture away from monumental history and toward everyday survival, toward kitchens, passageways, temporary lodging, shared infrastructure. Minor spaces become historically significant. The paper closes by arguing that these fugitive archives remain fragile. The photographs survived almost accidentally. They could easily disappear again. And this creates an ethical responsibility to continue reading against colonial archives, to continue searching for hidden histories, to continue imagining futures beyond the systems that attempted to erase them. Because sometimes the archive does not only preserve domination, sometimes unintentionally, it preserves resistance. It's a great article.